art repatriation, painting the picture for a better future.
Okay, so for the first one, we're going to be looking through an ethical lens, and from an ethical lens, one of the overarching impacts of art being returned to its origin is that it can help the citizens of a country that it's being repatriated to. It can instill a sense of pride in them, as well as helping them regain lost narratives. So according to Rafa and Kabanda, art has a certain cultural value that cannot be replaced. In the essay African Art Needs to Come Home, and This Is Why, Rafa and Kabanda claim that art produced by societies helps to define the national identities of its citizens by the history the art represents. For example, the Ahu'ula in Hawaii, which hasn't been stolen or anything, but this is just a good example of cultural value. When Hawaiians look at the Ahu'ula, they can see everything that it represents, and it helps them see their culture and their past, and how that helps them form an identity. Furthermore, the repatriation of this art can also help to educate lost narratives of a country. Bhattacharya claims that since art-rich countries such as India have been plundered and colonized by the West, they have lost narratives and heritage in the process because of the Western ideas that have been found on them. Furthermore, they also state that the context in which these stolen art places are represented in museums contributes to the imperial and orientalist ways of the West. This happens because the art is out of context, which is limiting to the culture that it came from, and it doesn't allow the art to be seen properly. This view of art is pretty unethical because every piece of art in every country deserves to have their art represented and viewed through a non-biased viewpoint, and that should happen with all art.
Alrighty, so now from an economic lens, while repatriating art may detract from the collective revenue generated by Western museums, this group ultimately finds the fiscal implications of art restitution to be advantageous for countries of origin. And this group thinks that Western museums should comply with requests to repatriate art to countries of origin, because these impacts are going to be enjoyed by countries that are already economically disadvantaged, and it's going to help them by providing a boost to their tourism industry, which will help to create more economic stability and eventually lead to the alleviation of poverty. All right. And repatriating art gives countries of origin a significant boost to their tourism industry by giving them material to capitalize on. And art can also contribute to the tourism industry by attracting visitors, creating jobs, and developing skills, while also attracting and retaining businesses, revitalizing places, and developing talent. And the costs required to build up the tourism industry are actually relatively low compared to other sectors, making it an actually realistic venture for third world countries to take in order to alleviate some of their poverty. And art can attract foreign cultural investment, which facilitates renovation of museums, transport and communication infrastructure, encourages the training of local staff and experts, increases research capacity, and also encourages the hosting of international art festivals, which are all ways that that art can help generate revenue in third world countries. And this boost will benefit both national and local economies by expanding employment opportunities and generating revenue. Emerging tourism industries also provide a boost to countries' overall their gross domestic products, and developing tourism can diversify the economy by allowing countries to not be dependent on a single item of export, and providing material to generate foreign currency receipts without environmental disturbance, because art is the product that's really being capitalized on. And countries who have been exploited of art primarily consist of third world, less developed countries. Many journalists have contended that the absence of artistic treasures in Africa is a huge loss to their economy. And all major international donor agencies, including the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Tourism Organization, all recognize the critical role that tourism plays in alleviating poverty in developing nations. So because these institutions that could help kind of donate some money to help third world countries pay for the upfront costs, they all recognize it. We can see this is definitely a realistic venture. And from this graphic, this kind of shows the distribution of top tourism cities in our world, and the darkly blue-colored countries are the ones that have the most cities, and these are mainly like big, like Western countries in the United States, and like countries in less developed areas like Africa are clearly lacking in this. So we can kind of help turn those countries blue by repatriating art.
So now we're getting into some of the limitations that we see, and so the first lens where we can see some of the limitations is historical. So historical precedence really plays a big factor in sort of how art restitution works and how successful it can be. For instance, when a country has a piece of artwork and they've had it for a long time, because the historical precedent lies within the country that is like more powerful, they essentially have the rights to that art because they have the power to it. And for art to be restituted, it takes extreme effort on behalf of whoever's claiming it because of this precedent. So for some few examples, for instance, in Egypt, this happened in 2010. This artwork right here, which was a fragment fresco from one of the Egyptian tombs, was stolen, and then eventually got down the line, got into the hands of the Louvre. And so what the Louvre did is they denied that this artwork had ever been taken illegally, and they said it was bought legally. But so for Egypt, who knew it was bought legally and had tons of proof to say it was so, it was very hard for them to get it back even in that sense. And the only way they were able to get it back is because their entire government said that they would cut off all cooperation with the Louvre if they did not send this artwork back. And even so, with that being said, it took 2 years after that threat was made for the artwork actually to be delivered back to Egypt. Another example of something like this that happened rather unsuccessfully, however, is in Nigeria with the Benin culture. Many African art institutions have been taken from over the years with colonialization. So one example is Nigeria, who has recently been trying to get more of their artwork and culture back, has gotten into negotiations with the Museum of London, who after years and years of negotiations have only now decided that they might consider loaning some artwork back. So Nigeria, which doesn't have as much power as a country like Egypt, which has rich and ancient culture, has only been able to get a loan back for artwork that was rightfully theirs. So why is repatriation so difficult in the modern world? Well, first off, no one really wants to give up invaluable materials and artwork for basically nothing in return. Even though they may have been obtained illegally, these nations and these museums have gotten this artwork and they have proven to be like giant sources of revenue, as we talked about in the economy slide. And so by sending them back to the home country, you're basically getting nothing but a pat on the back from the global community. There's no like patriot or no like funding from it. You basically are getting just doing the right thing, which unfortunately isn't something that has a big incentive. Second, owners are not really inclined to give up ownership of these artworks, especially when their countries and governments are giving them legal backing. So for one example, this picture right here was stolen by the Nazis in the 1940s and ended up in the hands of the Dutch. But because Dutch lawmakers and lawmakers around the world have an inherent bias towards like their own country and their own museums, they put in a law in place that forces the Dutch government and a committee to weigh the value that this artwork would have in a Dutch museum versus what it would have like in somebody's living room. And so they ended up ruling that it would be better off in somebody's like in the Dutch museum, and therefore like it stayed there and it didn't actually get restituted.
So politically, we see another limitation of art repatriation, specifically in terms of how different countries act towards repatriation. So first is that there are no internationally recognized statutes on where art restitution or repatriation should, or when it should happen. So the UN doesn't have any guidelines. They suggest it sometimes some countries, but there's no specific outline process that they provide or really any guidelines on when countries should be forced to repatriate. Another difficulty is that court cases involving artworks often take extensive amounts of money as well as time. So, for example, several court cases have been filed in the late 90s because that's when art repatriation became especially popular for other people or for countries to participate in. And those are still going on today. Some examples are the statue of Victoria's Youth that's held by the Getty Museum is really difficult because the Italians claim that they have that they own the statue. However, the Getty Museum says that since they bought it from a German art dealer, that it's in reality theirs. This court case has been going on for the late 90s. As well as Aiden was talking about, the Dutch changed their strategy on whether or not when museums should repatriate artwork. Another difficulty is the way that artwork is treated by artists. So they oftentimes don't leave complete records on when art or on where their art is owned by and who owns it, which makes it especially difficult in cases where their heirs control have artwork to have it repatriated to the museum or the artist.
So one of the main limitations of art repatriation is that when art is restituted and goes to its country of origin, it will be taken out of a high volume museum such as the Louvre or the Met and to put into a smaller museum or a smaller country with less tourists. So the Western people, Western civilizations won't be able to see the art, which is slightly sad. And another one is that whenever it goes back to the home country, they may not have adequate resources to house the art, so the art could be destroyed due to theft or war or anything that happens. And another limitation is that competing claims could slow down the art restitution process because it takes time and you have to have a lot of proof, and museums and people who would like their art back like to be 100% certain that that's where the art's going. There's no uncertainty.
Okay, so our group's resolution supports the repatriation of art to countries of origin. And while challenges certainly may arise, steps can be taken to mitigate some of these historical and political complications. Such effort is worth pushing in order to satisfy ethical demands by quashing colonial narratives and helping to instill a stronger sense of national identity in countries of origin. And another reason why this group supports our resolution is because of the economic benefits that are going to take play, like the boosting of the tourism industry, a more stable economy, and the alleviation of poverty. And these results are especially desirable because these benefits are going to be experienced by countries that deserve it, by countries that are already in a state of kind of economic depression. And to solve for issues pertaining to competing claims and inconsistent legal procedures, this group recommends that an international body with internationally applicable standards be established with a regulatory framework, perhaps a body under the UN. This body, made up of representatives from all stakeholders, would settle disputes through an orderly and organized process while also facilitating dialogue between nations and encouraging more negotiation to solve for some of these competing claims. And in order to solve for threats of terror, international donor agencies like the IMF and the World Bank could allocate funds to third world countries of origins in order to ensure that they're able to provide the proper security to keep these artworks protected. And another solution would be able to use the reparation money paid by Western museums when returning art, to use that money to pay for the staff and to pay for kind of the infrastructure needed to provide a more secure environment to protect artworks from any threats of terror. And there's also the argument that because of the economic benefits that would be provided by repatriating art, like there being more employment opportunities, terror groups would be less prone to recruit people because they have other outlets to turn to. And whenever the issue would come to, while governments can choose to sell off art to the highest bidder, whether or not state governments decide to sell it for private ownership or to use it as a public source to generate revenue, that could be a factor that's factored into negotiation processes. And so that's another way we could solve for it. And we believe that these solutions, while they could be complicated, they'll yield favorable results.
And these are our sources.
Okay, great, thank you. So Brendan, we'll start the questions with you. Describe how the content of the team presentation changed as a result of group discussion.
Yeah, so as we discussed, we found out that the political and the historical lenses weren't really favored towards supporting art repatriation. So we were forced to kind of exemplify and adapt on how those two lenses interacted with both the ethical and economic, which were overwhelmingly in support of repatriation, and how we can resolve that within our resolution.
Good, thank you. And Aiden, how did the group decide to include Hayley's perspective, conclusions, or lens into the overall presentation?
So Hayley's perspective was economic, and so what we did for her is we found out that like the economic policy really favors the countries of origin, that when we send these pieces back, they're going to see a huge financial benefit from them. And so we decided that that would play best into for repatriation, because these countries of origin are historically third world or poor countries, so they would benefit the most from having a financial boost.
Great, thank you. And Hayley, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Sammie's findings.
All right, well, I was kind of in the camp of wanting to repatriate art, but Sammie's ethical perspective kind of strengthened that, and it also made me kind of look past the like